Greetings and salutations, Garcia. Welcome to another how-to video. This is how to ice a source, and it is brought to you by your favorite childhood cartoon characters, or perhaps just my favorite cartoon characters from my childhood. So, what does it mean to ice a quote? He-Man is telling us that this is not the ice, and this is not the ice. To ice means three things. It means to introduce, it means to cite, and then it means to explain. You need to remember these three words. They're very important. We're going to take each one of them in turn. Introduce, cite, explain. But first, when do we use ice? We need to ice every quote you use in your paper. If you use a quotation, you need to ice it. You need to introduce, cite, and explain it. You can also ice facts. Sometimes it's important to remember that when you're using facts, those facts came from somewhere, and they need to be cited, and they also need to be explained. They don't always speak for themselves. We can come back to that. All right. When you introduce, there are a couple things that you can include. First of all, who said the quote is really helpful. Even in a story with characters, it's important to know who's talking if you're going to quote a character. If you're in a nonfiction text, say some research for a paper, then you should talk to us about the qualifications of the person that you're quoting. These won't always matter. If you're quoting somebody who's not an expert, you may not want to talk about their qualifications. In that case, you may not want to use them as a source at all. But if they have qualifications, you need to tell us what those are, because that lends credibility to that source. You also need to tell us any context so that we can understand what the quote is talking about. If there's a study, we need to know about the study. If there is something specific that they were looking at, then we need to know about that. This just helps to provide some context so the reader knows what your quote is even about. Alright, so that was the I. This is the C. When you cite, you've already had a video on in-text citations. If you are confused about that, please rewatch the video so that you know how to cite a source. That is the in-text citation, something like this. Okay, you have to have that after your quotation or after your fact. Then, explain. What do you need to do when you explain a quote? Well, the explanation is a sentence that connects your quote to your argument. It's kind of like the link in Melcon. It might also explain what the quote really means, because it's not always clear what the quote really means. So you're going to do that as your E. You cannot just throw in a quote and then walk away. Your reader will not understand what your quote supported. Sometimes it's important to pull out that word from the quote that really supported what you were trying to say, or show us how that example actually connects to your argument. But there's a couple things you do not want to do. Do not do the following. Do not just repeat the quote if it is obvious. Putting the quote twice in a row, even if you put it the second time in your own words, sometimes is really unhelpful. So if it's a complex quote, that might be helpful, but if it's an obvious quote, if it's clear what it means, don't just repeat what it just said. Secondly, do not repeat your argument or your main idea. The quote is not saying your main idea. The quote is saying something that supports your main idea. You need to explain that quote. You should not be repeating your argument or your main idea. We are going to show what that looks like in a couple minutes. So let's practice this. We've got a quote down here, and we're going to see if we can ice this together. Schools without uniforms tend to deal with issues that can be avoided with a uniform policy, and those incidents are not present in UNO because the uniform creates a standard which takes away the problems dealing with what a student is wearing. This is the argument. That's the main idea of this paragraph. It's the topic sentence. What we need to do is now ice this quote. So the first thing that we need to do is introduce it. Now, I'm not really sure how to introduce it unless I figure out which of my sources wrote this. So I'm going to go down to my Works Cited page. And this one is from Jake Holloway. So let's do this. According to Jake Holloway, a renowned expert in the field of school law And then we can quote him. So now we are aware of who said this, and we know that he's actually got something to say because he's a renowned expert. So that was the I. That just kind of introduced the quote a little bit. We could do more than that, but that is the very least that we must do. Then we need to have a C. We need to have the cite. So we go back to our works cited page. We need the first word from this entry, Holloway. And since this is a book, there are no paragraph numbers, there are page numbers. I got this from page 89, and then I'll put the period after it. Alright, so we have introduced, we have cited, and now we need to explain. Let's look at the quote again. Schools have lost that professional setting in which the primary focus is education. Now here's the original E that this author put. In other words, UNO should have uniforms. I don't think that's what the quote said. In fact, the quote didn't mention UNO at all. This author, Jake Holloway, doesn't even know what UNO is. So you can't say, in other words, UNO should have uniforms. So we're going to erase this. Because this is kind of like repeating our main idea up here. But we can't just do that. We actually need to look at what the quote says. So here is another way of doing this. Schools have lost that professional setting in which the primary focus is education. Instead of focusing on clothing, UNO could change the focus back to learning if it kept the school uniform policy. Now that is one way of explaining this quote, but we could certainly do it other ways. I mean, really what we need to do is to make sure that it's clear what this quotation shows us. So we might even say, as Holloway points out, it is easy to lose focus on learning, particularly when students are focused on fashion. And then this is even better, because now we've taken the quote and we've said, here's what he means, and then we bring it over to UNO. Let's do another example. Schools that require uniforms tend to constrict student personality, making students less creative. So this is actually the opposite argument, that we should not have a school uniform policy. 76% of those surveyed admitted that they felt that they had become less imaginative in their schoolwork since the uniform policy had been instituted. Hold on. 76% of those surveyed? What survey was this? Clearly, we need to introduce this as a source. So we're going to go down to our works cited page. We're going to see that this is by Duval, and it looks like they ran an experiment. So we're going to need to talk about that. But first of all, we need to go back up here. So, Duval, actually we should put his first and last name. What is his first name? Brad. Okay. Brad Duval and other researchers at the University of Maryland ran an experiment in which they surveyed students about the effects of having a dress code. See, now we're giving really important information. What the study was, who was in charge of it. We might even put the date. Ran an experiment in 1999. That could be important. We never know. Maybe things have changed since then. They found that, and then that's what we need to do. So now we've not only started this, but it's important that we say that they found that, because this is their results, and it won't make sense otherwise. They found that, and then 76%. So that's the I. Now we need to do the C. That's the cite. So we're going to put Duval and the paragraph number, because that was a web source. Alright, so we're down to the E. In other words, UNO should not have uniforms. We've got the same problem. This is not what that quote said. You cannot say, in other words. We can't just repeat what we want the argument to be. Instead, we need to have an actual explanation. Clearly, let's put this, clearly, it is not only students' personality that is constricted by uniforms. Rather, as Duval's study shows us, uniforms have a negative effect on students' ability to be creative. That is completely, or we could say that contradicts the purpose of uniforms in the first place. So sometimes, as you see, sometimes it takes more than one sentence to explain your quote. Don't just think that you can do it in one sentence, and please do not just repeat the argument. You've got to make sure that you actually say what the quote means and why it supports your own thesis statement. So, just to recap, this was our works cited page, but just to recap, to ICE means to introduce, to cite, and to explain. In the introduction section, you want to make sure that you provide enough information so that the reader knows where the quotation or information came from and why we should believe this source. To cite, you need to use an in-text citation. There's another movie on that. And when you explain, you need to make a connection to your argument. You cannot just repeat the argument, and you cannot just put the source into your own words. You also need to build a bridge back up to why you think that this information was important. And that is what you do when you're ICE. Good luck, Garcia.